Beneath the heavy silence of Alabama's backwoods, there lies a story too shameful for any family Bible, too grotesque to pass through gossip on front porches. It is the story of a man whose desires twisted beyond the limits of kinship, a patriarch who would impregnate his own mother, his own daughter, and his own sister within the same collapsing house of rot and whispers. This is not legend. This is not rumor. This is the anatomy of a bloodline carved into itself, until the children bore the scars of generations folded over like brittle pages of a book left too long in the damp. Imagine walking into that cabin, the boards creaking with every step, the air thick with mildew and shame, and knowing that every person within shared more than a roof. They shared the same man. He was born at a time when poverty and isolation bound families closer than law or church dared to question. The people in those hills and hollows were not strangers to hardship, nor to bending rules for survival. But this man, this father and son and brother, took those bends and snapped them until the lines between right and unspeakable wrong were erased. The first whispers of what he had done came not from the pulpit nor from the sheriff's desk, but from neighbors who noticed that the children in that house did not look quite right. Eyes too far apart, jaws that never quite matched, skin pale as if carrying some hidden sickness in their blood. And yet, no one spoke too loudly, because in those parts, silence was safer than truth. The cabin itself became a prison of repetition. His mother, old before her time, still bore his children. His sister, trapped by the same blood, was both aunt and mother to the brood that grew up wild around them. And the daughter, God help her, was born only to become a vessel in the same twisted cycle. The world outside saw nothing, or pretended not to. In Alabama's forgotten Otten Hills, the cruelty of incest did not scream. It whispered behind closed doors in lullabies that were half prayers and half curses. This is not the story of one man's lust. It is the story of a family tree grafted into itself until it rotted from the inside out. And tonight, we will trace that tree from its roots in dirt and desperation to the poisoned branches that stretched across generations. The origins of this patriarch story are not written in court records or carved into gravestones, but in the invisible scars passed down through the children he created. He was not born into power, nor wealth, nor any form of legacy that most men would envy. He was born into dust, into an Alabama farmhouse where poverty was not just a condition, but a destiny. The world outside his family's fence had already turned its back. No schools close enough to offer escape, no doctors to cure the sickness that came creeping through generations of kin marrying kin, no preacher strong enough to pull sin out by its roots. It was here, in this forgotten cradle of isolation, that his obsession began. He grew up watching boundaries dissolve within his own bloodline, a father who whispered to daughters, an uncle who took too much interest in the nieces who depended on him. These were not isolated horrors. They were customs buried in silence, rituals of ownership that blurred kinship until the titles of sister and mother and child became interchangeable. He did not invent the sickness, he inherited it. But unlike others before him, he embraced it openly, carrying it further deeper, until the house itself seemed to hum with the echoes of blood meeting blood. Neighbors would later say they had always suspected something was wrong. They told stories of how his mother never looked at anyone straight on, her eyes filled with the kind of shame that cannot be named. His sister, always thin, her face tight as though she was hiding pain she could never confess. And the children, barefoot, ragged, yet carrying that unmistakable resemblance that suggested they were not only brothers and sisters, but cousins, perhaps even closer than that. People whispered, yes, but whispers don't stop men like him. They only make the silence thicker. The patriarch, in his own mind, had become both the root and the trunk of his family. He saw himself as the beginning and the end, as if his blood was too important to be diluted by outsiders. He convinced himself it was strength, that his children were bound by a purity no stranger could corrupt. But behind those lies, there was nothing pure, only decay, only a sickness that was growing louder with every newborn cry that came from that house. As the years wore on, the house became less a home and more a shrine to his domination. He was not just the father figure. He was the gravitational pull around which every woman in that cabin orbited, trapped and tethered by blood. His mother, frail and bent, still carried his children long after her body should have been left in peace. His sister, silent and watchful, resigned herself to a fate she never chose, her pregnancies a cycle as predictable as the seasons. And then, the daughter, his own flesh, born into a world already poisoned by her lineage, was forced into the same role. Imagine the silence of that house at night. The cicadas buzzing outside, the creak of the boards above the dirt floor, and within those walls, women who had no escape. They did not resist openly because resistance had no meaning there. This was not a man who ruled by violence of the hand. He ruled by the weight of inevitability. In a land where neighbors turned away and the law kept its distance, he did not need chains. His chains were blood. The children born from this arrangement grew like shadows of themselves. Their faces bore the evidence of repetition, chins that did not line up, eyes set too close or too wide, spines that bent wrong before adulthood had even set in. Some died young, their bodies unable to carry the strain of their own blood. Others lived on, haunted by the fact that they could never explain to outsiders why they looked the way they did. They were walking secrets, living proof of the unspeakable. And still no one stopped him. No sheriff rode up the dirt road to question the cries of new infants year after year. No preacher dared step into that cabin to condemn the patriarch for what he had done. Poverty, isolation, and shame had conspired to make him untouchable. And so, the cycle repeated, unchecked, until his presence was etched not only in the faces of his children, but in their very blood. He became more than a man. He became the architect of his family's ruin. The house, once just timber and nails, had turned into something else, a living tomb where generations folded into each other. It stood as a monument to what happens when silence is chosen over truth, when neighbors whisper instead of act, and when a man convinces himself that the rules of God and nature no longer apply. What makes this story unbearable is not simply what he did, but how ordinary it seemed within those four walls. To the outside world, incest is a word drenched in taboo, a sin beyond comprehension. But to his children, born and raised in that house, it was the rhythm of daily life. They did not know another world existed. They did not know that daughters were not meant to become mothers by their fathers, that sisters were not supposed to share the same bed with brothers, that blood was meant to branch outward, not coil inward like a snake devouring its own tail. When visitors rarely came, the children were kept hidden or quiet. Their pale faces would peek out from behind door frames, watching strangers with wide, suspicious eyes. And always, there was the unmistakable sense that they were being concealed, not to protect them, but to protect the secret that defined the family. The patriarch himself would sit in his chair, calm, unmoved, as though daring anyone to question what they saw. Few did. No one wanted to carry the weight of accusation in a town where proof was hard to gather and shame even harder to expose. The women carried that weight in silence. His mother, who had once rocked him to sleep, now carried the knowledge that her womb had been turned into a breeding ground by the son she had raised. His sister, trapped by loyalty to family and the impossibility of escape, bore the quiet anguish of knowing her children were also her nieces and nephews. And the daughter, her story is perhaps the cruelest. Born into a house that denied her innocence from the very beginning, she was raised only to be folded back into the cycle, her role decided before she had the chance to speak her first words. Outside, life in Alabama went on as if nothing was wrong. Families tended their fields, churches filled on Sundays, and the sheriff's badge still shone beneath the southern sun. But inside that house, the rules of the world no longer applied. The patriarch had created a kingdom of silence, one where morality was not absent but inverted, where family ties were tightened into knots that strangled the very idea of kinship. And as each generation passed, the secret grew heavier. The children became living reminders of what had been done, their faces betraying the lies that words could never cover. Each one was a testimony written in bone and blood, carried forward into a future that could not escape the sins of the past. There comes a point in every hidden history when the silence can no longer hold. For this family, it was the children themselves who became the cracks in the wall, their faces, their mannerisms, their uncanny resemblances to one another. All of it raised questions too heavy to ignore. Neighbors whispered more boldly now. They noticed that when the daughter bore her first child, the baby looked almost identical to the children already crawling at the feet of her grandmother and aunt. And the whispers grew darker, that this was not coincidence, that this was not rumor, but truth staring them in the face. Still, the outside world hesitated. Who among them wanted to accuse a man of such crimes without proof? Who among them wanted to be the one to drag a family's shame into the open? The people of those Alabama hills had lived too long with secrets. They had seen too much, so the cabin was left alone, a blemish in the woods that everyone saw but no one touched. It became easier to say nothing, to pretend the cries of infants and the hollow stares of half-blood children were just another sad story of poverty. But within the house, the cycle began to break, not from repentance, but from collapse. The patriarch's strength faltered as age caught him, yet his hunger did not. The women, worn thin by years of forced submission, carried scars too deep for outsiders to see. Some of the children died before adulthood, their bodies failing under the weight of bloodlines too close. Others lived, but bore the cruel marks of their origin. Crossed eyes, twisted spines, minds that wandered in confusion, never finding clarity. And though none dared speak it aloud, those children became walking confessions, living proof that the patriarch's reign was not merely rumor but fact. By now he had impregnated mother, daughter and sister under the same roof, and the very structure of the house seemed to sag under the weight of that sin. Its walls carried the muffled cries of generations consumed by one man's obsession. If you were to walk by at night, you might see a single light in the window flickering and wonder what kind of life endured inside. But if you stepped closer, if you dared enter, you would understand why the neighbors kept their distance. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Time has a way of covering sins with dust, but it never erases them. Long after the patriarch's body gave way to the soil, his presence lingered in every child he left behind. They carried his features in their faces, his shadow in their blood. Some stayed in the hills, trapped in the very cycle he created, while others drifted outward, seeking lives in towns where no one knew their names, where their past could be buried beneath layers of new beginnings. Yet even there the truth followed, because blood does not lie. It carries memory, deformity, silence. It carries him. Stories spread, not through official channels, but through whispers carried across decades. Families in nearby towns told their children to stay clear of that hollow, warning them without saying why. Older folks who had once seen the children remembered their twisted features, their vacant stares, their strange resemblance to one another, and they passed the memory along like a curse. The house itself, eventually left to rot, became a husk of wood and mildew, a shell of the horrors it had once contained. But those who walked past it claimed they could still feel something in the air, a heaviness, as if the walls themselves remembered. What haunts most is not only what he did, but how close it came to disappearing forever. If not for the children, those walking testaments of his obsession, the story might have been lost. There are no court cases to read, no sermons preserved in church records, no newspaper headlines to confirm what happened. Only faces, only rumors, only the knowledge carried in the bodies of those who had no choice but to live with his decisions. That is the tragedy. Not that one man committed these acts, but that an entire community allowed silence to be stronger than justice. In the end, his story is not confined to a single family. It is a reflection of how darkness thrives in ploughs, says where poverty, isolation, and fear keep mouths shut. The Patriarch is gone, but others like him have walked the same earth, unchallenged, their legacies hidden in plain sight. And somewhere, in the long, quiet stretches of America's forgotten hills, there are still houses like his, where truth is buried, where silence reigns, and where the blood of the past refuses to die. There is a reason this story feels heavier than most. It is because it forces us to stare at something we are taught to look away from, the possibility that evil does not always come in the form of strangers, but often grows inside the family itself. The Alabama Patriarch was not a monster from folklore or a criminal dragged into the light of justice. He was a father, a son, a brother. He sat at the same tables, ate the same food, prayed to the same God as those around him. Yet inside his house, he rewrote the rules of kinship into something unspeakable. What remains now is a caution carved into silence. His descendants, if they live still, walk among us. They may never speak his name. They may never admit the truth of how their line began. But somewhere in their blood, in their memory, he lingers. Each face that looks just a little too much like another, each child who wonders why their family history is shrouded in secrecy. These are his echoes. He has long since returned to dust, but he has not vanished. He survives in the very thing he corrupted, blood. The house itself is gone, but the ground remembers. Locals say that when the wind cuts across those fields at night, the trees seem to bend toward the place where it once stood, as if the earth itself leans into memory. And though people rarely speak of it, when they do, their voices drop lower, as if afraid that even saying the words aloud might bring back the curse. Some stories are told to entertain, others are told to warn. This one, however, was never meant to be told at all. It is a story the land tried to bury, a story the family tried to forget, and a story the community refused to face. Yet here we are, unearthing it again. A patriarch who impregnated his own mother, his own sister, and his own daughter beneath the same roof. A house where bloodlines collapsed into themselves until they could no longer old. And a silence that stretched for generations, louder than any confession. Somewhere, hidden in the folds of American history, there are countless stories like this, archived not in books, but in whispers, in deformities, in shadows. And if you've listened this far, then you know the truth. The past is never really gone. It lingers in the soil, in the blood, and in the echoes of houses that should never have been built.